And we're beginning. So here I'm just reviewing. This is, I mean, for the exam, we already know this. It's a skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. We really didn't touch on any of this. We really confined ourselves last time to bones and skin. Oh, announcement. We're having a guest speaker on Friday. Someone you just had occasion to speak in a forum with. Taya is coming our way. She's great. She's great. One of our graduates is graduating from WeCom in Seton Hill. She's going to be online with us Friday. And she just got accepted she's graduating. She got accepted, which means they match. They're ready to, like, a family practice residency program. We were, Olivia and I and Noor, we're all in it's basically like recruiting for high school students. We collectively call outreach. So we had like an hour thing, like between 11:30 and 12:30. And Olivia spoke, and Taya spoke, and I spoke. All trying to share this with some of the local high schools. So she was very impressive, very impressive. So I think you enjoy talking to her because you guys are sufficiently close. You're not that far apart, age, experience wise, or anything like that. I think you get a better feel. You can ask her whatever. She'll tell you. I mean, and she did very well. We have another gal there who probably would be. I don't know if she's going to have. I don't know if you know Andy or not. I'm trying to remember her last name. Real comes. Moving on. So what does muscle do? Basically, we're going to focus mostly on skeletal here. If we don't get this done, I'll carry it through probably on Monday of next week. I'll let Dr. Hillig handle the Friday portion of the program. Give my voice a rest. Okay. So we know what do muscles do? Okay. They differ between the types of muscles. Skeletal is voluntarily controlled. We decide. Cardiac and smooth muscle are strictly under control. We're non-controlled, as it were. Whether it's the autonomic nervous system controlling the smooth, or the autonomic nervous system controlling the cardiac, there's some similarities and there's some differences. Skeletal and cardiac muscle have visible stripes. That implies a great deal of strength and power. Cardiac muscle does not have visible stripes or striations. All of those stripes or striations, you recall, deal with the overlapping of actin and myosin filaments that are there. And these are all the things they do. It's pretty well self-explanatory. So again, commonly called muscle. Typically when you say muscle, you're saying it's skeletal muscle. And another term we obviously use is striated muscle, conscious control. All these things are inherently what muscle does. So the other things that muscle does indirectly, okay, utilizing muscles generates heat. When you shiver, we all remember that. And again, and just a very contraction. We talked about that with blood, with venous return and lymph, which we have gotten to in our advanced physiology lecture, about how the muscle almost has a pumping mechanism to return fluid centrally. So it plays a pivotal role in a lot of these areas. So there's a tremendous amount, as well as mechanical activity, mostly to create movement. It's protective in nature. Muscles make up boundaries, which is something they don't state, but you understand when you treat patients who are ill. I mean, crossing a boundary, and these folks have heard, when we talk about stage 4 cancer, it means it's crossed a significant boundary, and that boundary typically is the diaphragm. Something can cross a major muscle boundary. Once it gets into muscle or can cross over a muscle, it's trouble. I had my bladder cancer, basically determining factor on how severe it was. If it had got into the muscle and they had to remove that muscle, it would have been very difficult for me to continue doing what I'm doing. Very, very difficult. And have a much more guarded, maybe the wrong word, significant prognosis. Just the same way when someone has a 4, it means it has crossed that boundary, typically the diaphragm. So if you have an abdominal lymphoma, and now it's on the other side of the diaphragm, now that's a stage 4. So, there's muscle plays an important role. This is all, you can read this as well as I can. It either attaches to bone directly, sewing itself into the bone, or by a tendon. Not all muscles have tendons, as you guys from anatomy already know. Many of them do. Not all of them do. Sometimes they'll insert into something called an aponeurosis. So, for instance, your abdominal muscles really are attached to the bones, the rib bones, more than anything else, maybe to the ilium and areas like that. But where they insert is sort of in that central area. There's an aponeurosis, which is sort of like a muscle and ligament combination that, when people work out, it reflects as a six-pack. Things like that, it sort of demonstrates that. Muscles in your back, the trapezius, for instance, would be a very good example of it. It's a large, gray, thick material where muscles adhere to it. The trapezius maybe being the nose. Actually, that's its major attachment other than the bones that it attaches to. And in the foot, you have something called the plantar fascia here. A lot of athletes have something called plantar fasciitis, the peel, sprain across the sole of their foot. That basically is like a bowstring from your heel all the way to sort of the base of your toes. Very easy to hurt. Very easy to hurt. And classically, and you should know this, I don't abide by it because nowadays we talk about attachments because we know muscles. Origin and insertion are the terms. Origin usually is the part that moves the least. Insertion is the part that moves more. The reality is, it works both ways. I mean, am I pushing down on a gas pedal or am I standing on my tiptoes to reach something in an upper shelf? You're using the same muscle. You're using basically the Achilles tendon complex, the gastrocnemius and the soleus. You're plantar flexing your foot. But one, the origin is the calf itself when you're stepping down on a gas pedal. When you go up to reach something, the stable point, the so-called origin now is the heel foot portion, and you're going all that, you're trying to reach up. So it's kind of different. So the attachment, the other end known as insertion, smaller bone, farther from the midpoint, relative to the larger bone. That's classic anatomy. So I don't know what there's difference between classic and functional anatomy. If it's a question on an exam, you have to go back to classical, unless they specifically say mechanically which would be the origin and which would be the insertion. That's the way I would look at it. So, and then how do we classify them? Do they work together or differently? Agonists, by definition, are prime movers. Your flexors are your prime movers, period. So the antagonists keep them in check. They antagonize them. So in the upper extremity, the flexors are anterior. In the lower extremity, they're posterior. And the extensors are anterior in the lower extremity and posterior in the upper extremity. So the triceps is an antagonist to the agonist of the brachialis and the biceps brachialis. So that's, and a lot of times they work together. A lot of times we use muscles synergistically. So technically speaking, a synergist is a muscle that helps the agonist, the prime mover, as a stabilizer. I mean, you can look at some examples. If you go through tracking through these different muscles, and typically they give you something like that, I think, in a passage. You're not going to say, is the anconeus a synergistic muscle, and if so, what does it do? That's a little muscle around your elbow. They're not going to use that. But in a passage, you might have to know that I would think that's where that would probably be sort of rear its ugly head. And a lot of times they act together, the antagonist, the agonist, the synergist, and really this is what posture is and typical movement is. You're class, there's a whole line of people we're waiting to go into the class. You stop. Where your muscles are still, there's limited motion. You're moving forward, you're sort of like people on the way. Little motions like that. You're using antagonists, flexors, and extensors, and the helper muscles all move themselves. It's one big happy family of muscles. Forced me to get up. No idea how tired I was. Oh, how was Ecuador?
It was great.
Oh, enjoy.
Yeah.
You had to put up with Kinsey the whole time. You with Kinsey?
I love Kinsey.
Uh,
She was doing your eyeball questions at the airport.
Oh, good. We have to talk about your choices. Your choice of friends. You all know I'm joking. Were you the only two from non-nursing?
Then Diamond, she's helping.
Okay.
And then there was a medicine,
Okay.
but yeah, it was
Who went from Nuke Med?
Liz.
If I had her. I'll have to look. Yeah, I had a lot of nuclear medicines. Listen, when they went to Nicaragua, everybody, before they got it safe now to go, Dr. Ross, it was a game life changer. I mean, it was almost all nursing students, obviously not limited to them, but their world changed. They were just, they saw real life things. Moving on. And the national soccer team is doing well.
In Ecuador?
Yeah.
Yeah, they were talking about
Yeah,
that.
but they were talking about that. Yeah, Ecuador is going to make the World Cup. Make the World Cup. They made it 4 years ago. Good team. Okay. Okay, so they act together, and yeah, helping circulation, moving the lymphatics around. They're showing you, like here, pectoralis minor is a stabilizer. Pectoralis major, you might remember, is where your breast sits on, plays a big role in moving your arm. That's a prime move. The minor typically stabilizes so that the other muscles can work. The temperature control, you can read that. All of these types of things that are there part of it. So that's general. This is the part I can't help you with so much. So I mean, this is a likely MCAT topic because it applies physics. I skip it. I apologize. You've got Dr. Buxton. Ask him the difference between first. You should know an example of first class, second class, or whatever lever this is. I don't know. I don't do physics. Ask him next time. Ask him right after this. Okay. 3 levers, such class 3 levers, which I think is the most common that are there. So you can read through that as well as I can. I'm into the physiology part of it. So we look at the smallest functional unit of the skeletal muscle is nothing more, as you remember, than a long chain of cellular components called sarcomeres. Individual components that are basically identical. Effectively, and when we're talking about a muscle cell, we're talking about a long structure that may be very, 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 very thin, much thinner than what you could see with the naked eye, but filled with components. So the cell itself, the individual cell, is a unique cell. I mean, it's got multiple nuclei. It's an oddball type of a cell. It's almost considered almost like an infusion or amalgamation of all these components. And effectively, all they are, and it's a really good analogy, little box cars, basically that do the same thing. And what they do, so you guys remember, is effectively they shorten. And because they shorten, depending on the shape of the muscle, the anatomy of the individual muscle, it will shorten the muscle itself and will cause motion. It's not like it's folding or bending. It's shortening, and depending on the anatomy of the muscle, it'll cause a particular kind of movement. Some of them will bulge in the middle, like the biceps. For those of you who have a biceps that bulges, not me. See, I'm going to the gym now, and I said, I get on those machines. I mean, it's like 140. I move it down to 20. You can relate to this. You got these big numbers on this. They're bench pressing, they're gonna free weights. I'm like, oh my god. Pardon me? I bet you do. So if I got on the machine after you, 1/10 of whatever the setting is. I'm not proud. I'm old. Within the last 3 days, both of my sons and one daughter-in-law have said, hey, when are you going to retire, Dad? Father can speak to his children in certain ways. I have students who want me to come visit them. So the sarcomere is the big player. The filament, basically, it's the movement of actin and myosin filaments over one another. The myosin are the thick, and they are by definition motor proteins because they change shape. And in doing so, and we probably should get around and show you that animation again. So we'll take a look at that with regard to the heads. And the difference is that they're an interesting kind of a protein. They're technically a globular protein. Of course, when they've all come together, effectively they become insoluble. So the actin's a remarkable protein that we see all the time. It's involved in amoeboid motion of cells. It's involved in endocytosis and exocytosis. It's pushing on cell membranes. So that and so we can basically make it and break it down. So G, or globular actin, most of the body is one we can build and break down. When we make strands of it, becomes fibrous actin, insoluble. But it's like microtubules we can do the same thing for, which is neat. And we can do those kinds of things. And once they're in the sarcomere, basically they're going to be globular actin molecules, unless they were decomposing because of an injury, will form that fibrous strand. And both of these, the myosin and the actin, have active sites that when they bond together, even though they're not technically touching one, they're not in direct contact, the bond that they form is so powerful and so energetic that it causes effectively this myosin head, which is in a cocked, preloaded position, sort of like I always thought the best thing was like a crossbow type of emotion. William Tell, Game of Thrones, just kind of, once they come together, and it pulls them, as you'll see with the sarcomere, toward the midline. And so and it's easier for me to show it to you. The myosin actin filaments overlap and slide past each other. There's what they call the Z line. Okay. So effectively, the sarcomeres are bounded by what they call Z lines or Z discs. And I can explain it better than I can go read through this type of stuff. Maybe we should do it. Let's do this part, and then I'll try to cook up this animation. It might work out a little bit better. So voila, we have all this. We have effectively, this is a muscle. And you can go back and review the anatomy. The muscle that you and I see is a whole muscle. Okay, it's surrounded by an outer layer called epimysium that can be quite thick. Then effectively each of these bundles are separated by a thinner amount of connective tissue, not thin, but thinner with more fat in it, and they're called fascicles. And if you pull out one of these fascicles, I mean, it just keeps repeating itself. What it's filled with are fibers. The fibers are the individual cells, this unique multicellular thing. And if you pull out the fiber, it's filled with protein rods called fibrils. And those fibrils are filled with additional protein rods, okay, and something called sarcoplasm. Now we use the term sarco. And so if we pull out one of those rods and take a look at it, what we're going to see is the individual unit called a sarcomere. So here we've taken this structure, brought it down here, and now we've pulled out one of these fibrils and taken a look. And we look at the relationship here. And it's better for me to show it from the other PowerPoint. And when you look up close and personal, you begin to see this characteristic light and dark banding. They're going to ask you the same thing, A bands and I bands. They have fancy names called anisotropic and inotropic, but we call them dark because the thin and the thick filaments overlap, and light because there's no overlap. So again, there's no I in light, there's no A. People got that wrong. God's honest truth. So I thought, how do I know it's an A band? There's no A. There's an A in dark and there's an I in light. It's the easiest thing in the world to remember. See, he's remembering it. And so, and I'll go over through all the steps. It's easier if I do it than show you these stupid things in read. We'll animate. How's that sound? Sound like fun? We have time to animate. There's Jacob coming in that messed me up. I can blame anybody. I hear you. Oh, we did the physiology this term. What am I doing? I'll make sure I'll put these on. I'm almost, look at the size of that. It's ridiculous. To me, the whole tail is this. It's a fast download. Hopefully we have sound. No guarantee we're going to have sound. That's out. If there's any questions, we'll play. So that's the same picture we're looking at. I just want to make it as clear as possible. So that's, here you can see it's probably a hamstring muscle. You can see all of the fascicles. It's like when you go in and look at, look at whatever kind of a steak that would be. Sounds delicious. Muscle fibers. So here you can see the fascicles. Pull out a fascicle. Here inside the fascicle, you have individual fibers. That's the true cell. Here are these, and just a series of these flexible rods packed very, very closely. So one thing is there's a lot of protein in a close packed area. A little bit of fatty tissue, some more, some less, depending on the muscle. A lot of the red comes from myoglobin. You'll remember that. They told the same thing. You remember these kinds of things. And this, when we're really looking at the physiology, we've got to look here. Take a look at the individual fiber, and then we begin to look at the banding pattern. And the banding pattern really is when we start taking a look inside that fiber and looking at the interior fibril, diminutive, and inside the fibril itself. Again, filaments, this just gives you the name. Because it's a unique cell, remember, glycosomes for glycogen is the energy supply. Myoglobin for oxygen is the oxygen supply. They all have myoglobin. Some have more than others. That's the difference between what we would look at red meat and white meat, so to speak. The organelles themselves are different. So the organelles themselves are really, we have a lot of mitochondria that are available, but we have basically underneath the exterior, the cell membrane itself, we call the sarcolemma. And you're going to see the sarcolemma is modified so that there's extensions that penetrate at right angle and surround, as you will see, all of these fibrils eventually are surrounded by a unique, when we get into the unique muscle fiber. So here you're going to see the endomysium, the connective tissue that's outside of it, loose connective tissue. Deep to it, you have the sarcolemma or the sarcoplasmic membrane, and extensions like this reach inside throughout, surrounding all of those bundles. All those. My son's telling me because he had to take some medicine. Test came out negative, so he's in good shape. And all of these bundles are surrounded by the aspects of the sarcoplasmic membrane or sarcolemma called T or transverse tubules because they go at right angles. So rather than longitudinal and transverse, as you will see, and then you will certainly remember. And then what we begin to see associated with these, and they go almost exactly at the A and I band junction on either side, are a large amount of smooth endoplasmic reticulum we call sarcoplasmic reticulum. And they have little pockets or well-like structures called terminal cisterna. And they are, for one thing, and it's all about calcium, skeletal muscle work on calcium inside. It's influenced by calcium outside, but the calcium's in there. Whether it's released and floods the cell, or whether it's pulled back in, is the difference between a muscle that's contracting and a muscle that's relaxing or has become relaxed. So all of these are part of it. That's the anatomy. You can see the structures. Again, A bands, etc. I bands, the Z disc or Z line, and because they zigzag, it was given that name. So muscle is very distinctive microscopically. If they would show you a microscopic, something like that microscopically on the test, it would be very evident to me, very, very clear. But it is so, and this is to me, this is the big discussion we had in that presentation. Nowadays, it's molecular biology 101. We look at what happens on a molecular basis to understand. Years ago, we looked at a cellular basis. We really didn't understand all this stuff. So you will see this. And again, the boxcar analogy. So here you go. I mean, we just have a continuous pattern of these. So the actin in the blue is on either side of the Z disc roughly equally. The myosin is central. It's not detached from the Z disc, but as you might remember, or you will see, it has an elastic component called titin, T-I-T-I-N. And this is a better illustration. And this shows the relationship. It's about a 2-to-1 relationship in skeletal muscle of myosins to actin. And you see everywhere there's a myosin, they mutually share the actins that are in blue. And when we see that, that's the dark zone. If we're in the I band, no overlap, clear. If we're in that midline, there's no overlap, that H zone, okay, no overlap. And then, and this M is sort of basically this myomycin, this particular protein, it probably just anchors it centrally. And here you can see the titin with that sort of spring configuration. So think of the elasticity we typically have in our muscles. And certainly you would think one of the ways you damage it when you really damage a muscle. It's like injuries are just so. Who's that really great gal basketball player who did an ACL Monday night from UCLA, USC? Juju. Pardon me? I think so, like that. I mean, they were number 1 overall seed, I thought. Boom, actually. Crazy. So, I mean, injuries are so hard to predict. You're probably Phillies fan. No. It's okay. I know who beat you the last time in the World Series. Yankees. And here our best pitcher, Tommy John surgery that Garrett Cole from this neck of the woods avoided last year's Rookie of the Year. He's out for at least 2 months minimum. We have a word for that in sport. That's the word. We're effed. Soto went to the Mets. Did you have Aaron Judge? Still pretty good. So, and you see the heads and the cross bridges, and we'll do the animations, etc. And the role. And the other thing that I should stress are these are the proteins. The only one that moves is the myosin. These are regulatory proteins. And basically, as you will see, what happens here's this strand of actin. This strand-like protein called tropomyosin covers all of these active sites. That's where the bond occurs with the myosin. It's held in place by little plugs of troponin. Troponin anchors them there. When calcium already in the cell floods the interior as it's released from those storage wells, what does it do? It alters the configuration, it bonds to the troponin, changes its shape, allows this to slide in such a way that it exposes these actin heads. And the actin heads immediately, I think we go backwards, actin heads, which are already in close proximity, will bind with companion active sites on the myosin head and trigger this. So you can see and they name them, and this is something to remember. On a test question, actin, they often name it for what they're going to bond to. So even though it's a myosin head, actin binding sites, and if it's if it's on the myosin, if it's on the actin, they're myosin binding sites. It's a little annoying, but don't read the questions thoroughly. You have more time than you think. Students budgeting time. This is test taking is so important. I mean, people don't believe me. I know somebody who's teaching you at college level. Oh, they're brilliant and what? I'm not. I'm good. I'm not great. I am a great test taker. Yes, I'm not trying to be modest like that. Believe me, my wife will come in here and tell you how stupid I am every day. I didn't shut the door yesterday completely, and the dog chased the cat. The cat jumped up on one of our blinds. Guess what? I'm going to have a new one. I am going to hear it when we get home. Not that smart. You know whose fault it has to be in a relationship. Don't. Got it. Yeah, you just, oh yeah, you're just like, yeah. Sure. Has to be your fault. So, okay. Without, I'd rather. This is kind of what happens when it's relaxed. You can see all those zones, and when it contracts, you can see how these shrink compared to width of the eye band here. Look what happens to the sarcomeres, as you remember. Here's my cursor. Oh, Pest was in the same place. There it is. There it is back in the lab. So you can see all of those things, and I'll go through it. But this is, to really understand it, you have to understand exactly what happens. And they're explaining it is a better review than I get, because there's really a series of events. And if we don't get to all of it, which is fine, we'll get to most of it. What made it go in the first place? It's voluntary. You and I say, do this, do that, whatever. So our brain basically sends, it's a two-nerve circuit from your brain, either to a cranial nerve or to a spinal nerve, so an aspect either in your brain stem or in your spine. That's the first circuit. And the second circuit is a nerve going from either the brain stem itself or typically more frequently from the spinal cord, going out to the specific muscle saying, move. That's the circuit. So once that's an electrical signal being carried, assume the circuit is intact and it's got no damage or injury or medical condition or et cetera, effectively, this is what happens. It basically goes to an area called the neuromuscular junction. That's a modified receptor. Basically, it's a protein end plate where the nerves basically either talk to other nerves or they talk to targets and end organ structures. The neuromuscular junction is as famous as any of them. It's got a lot of surface area. Again, this is recurrent theme of surface area, so it can be excited relatively rapidly. We'll see how it's excited. Once it's excited, it does something called excitation contraction coupling. We're going to transduce the electric, basically this chemical energy. First, we're transducing an electrical signal into a chemical release. Now we have to create an electrical signal off a muscle going throughout that muscle or that sarcomere or along that individual muscle fiber rather, and then somehow translate that to contraction. So we're coupling electrical energy, which we're transforming a couple of times. We're transducing it. And then finally, actually how it works on that level. So we can go through all those, but I'd rather let them do the talking. Come back. These work. Make me look good. You look good.
Skeletal muscles. An action potential propagates down a motor neuron to a muscle fiber. Like where a motor neuron connects a skeletal muscle fiber, called the neuromuscular junction. This junction is a chemical synapse consisting of the points of contact between the axon terminals of a motor neuron and the motor end plate of the skeletal muscle fiber. Events at the neuromuscular junction occur in 7 coordinated steps. Step 1. An action potential travels the length of the axon of a motor neuron to an axon terminal. Step 2. calcium ions diffused into the terminal. Step 3. Calcium entry causes synaptic vesicles to release acetylcholine via exocytosis. Step 4. Acetylcholine diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds to acetylcholine receptors, which contain ligand-gated cation channels. Step 5. Ligand-gated cation channels open. Step 6. Sodium ions, shown here in red, enter the muscle fiber, and potassium ions, shown here in blue, at the muscle. The greater input is a membrane potential negative. Step 7. Once the membrane potential reaches a threshold value, an action potential propagates along the sarcolemma. Neurotransmission to a muscle fiber ceases when acetylcholine is removed from the synaptic cleft. This removal occurs in two ways. 1. Acetylcholine diffuses away from the synapse. 2. Acetylcholine is broken down by the enzyme acetylcholinesterase to acetic acid and choline. Choline is then transported into the axon terminal for the synthesis of acetylcholine.
I think we're about done. Okay. So the whole idea, I mean, without going crazy over this, it's just so terribly important. It's almost like a stepwise type of a thing as we begin to look at it. Here's the signal that's going to, and as I said before, electrical, all that this idea of being an electrical, first thing we have to do is we have to change this electrical signal into basically the release of a chemical. That's what a nervous system is. Basically, we communicate by way of chemicals. So the action potential, oh, be quiet. Thank you. So there's the neuromuscular junction, and typically, without going crazy, they're not going to ask you about the specifics of motor end plates, but there's multiple terminals along this, basically this unique protein structure. So what makes it all happen in the first place? Well, the very first thing, before we even start by releasing this acetylcholine, the signal is triggered by voltage-gated calcium channels. An electrical signal is an electrical signal, as it's basically traveling on the exterior of the membrane, and it basically flips a switch close to the terminus of that axon, of that little bulb, and it releases, and that releases calcium. The calcium facilitates the release of the acetylcholine. Basically, it triggers those V snares and T snares, and the synaptic vesicles are filled, and the only thing they're filled with is acetylcholine, and it's unique. A lot of nerves secrete more than one thing. This is a nerve at the neuromuscular junction. It just releases acetylcholine. So yeah, if you're going to pick one neurotransmitter to know everything about, it's acetylcholine because it's the most common. This is the first step. So see what's going on here. This goes down to the axon terminal. There's step 1. See the way they express it. We look more closely in here. So as the calcium, basically, it causes the exocytosis or facilitates the release. Voltage-gated calcium channels. This is the part where calcium outside the muscle cell plays a role. So, I mean, as we look at all these muscles, the heart and the smooth muscle rely a lot on, cardiac and smooth rely a lot on calcium in the bloodstream, extracellular calcium. Here, the only reason we rely on extracellular calcium is that it has a sufficient amount to allow this process to facilitate the exocytosis, the granules that are there. Didn't want that. We look bad again. Let's kind of where we left off, and here it goes into the second step. So after the channel, we get the calcium, the voltage-gated channels that do their thing. I'm trying to get done with as much as I can. Now in exocytosis, these synaptic vesicles releases the acetylcholine, pretty straightforward stuff. Nothing to really talk about there. And then now, effectively, we have chemicals that have been released. What these chemicals do, so these are not voltage, but ligand or chemically gated channels, and it's a two-way channel. The acetylcholine bonds, and as it starts to bond, it allows 3 sodiums in, 2 potassiums out. The current idea of 3 in, 2 out. Or if we look at the resetting of the cell with sodium potassium pumps, 3 sodiums out, 2 potassiums back in to eventually restore the chemical conditions inside the acetylcholine. And so, and as we'll see later, it's a question of how many of these doorways are opened as to whether or not it's something we call an end plate potential, which is becoming more likely to fire, versus a true action potential where it's going to fire, and we're going to generate through the whole. We're going to have to reach that arbitrary level, that number called threshold. So that's all part of it as well. So here you are seeing that in with the good, out with the bad, acetylcholine receptors without getting too wordy, ligand-gated channels. And so as long as there's calcium, as long as there's acetylcholine, this keeps happening. We see the 3-to-2 relationship, potassium and sodium, and then eventually may or may not reach threshold. How do we get rid of this stuff and make it stop happening? We have acetylcholinesterase. So that's the other part that's so important here. Acetylcholine might diffuse. This is open. It's not surrounded by a capsule or some enclosure per se. It's sort of like an open portion. So some of the acetylcholine will diffuse. We use it all over the place, and the components as well. Some of it will be broken down by acetylcholinesterase. Okay, and the neat thing about that is the acetic acid is one component. We use that all over the place. The choline is reuptake. They call it reabsorb, but basically all the 3 ways neurotransmitters are removed get removed effectively by this here at the neuromuscular junction. We have diffusion, we have metabolism or breakdown, and finally we have reabsorption. Then the next one we'll look at next time will be how we finally get to this action potential. We have to hold on to that thought until I'm back here, same bat time, same bat station on Monday.